I would like to just take a moment to say to you that I really don't think you fully understand what has happened to these people that you look at as second class or inferior citizens in this nation. Black people who were brought to this country were stripped of their names, language, culture, religion, God, and taken totally away from the history of themselves. Here are 30 million people who don't wear their own names, they wear your names. Who don't speak their own language, they speak English, which is not their language. They never were allowed their own cultural expression of Africa. Don't you realize that when you turn a people upside down and inside out, then sell them not for a day, not for a year, but for 300 years and deny us the human right to know, to read a book, to learn, to understand. And then after 300 years of that, you allow us into the church, but by that time, you've painted Jesus white, God white, the angels white, and then all these black people have been subjected to a form of white supremacy, which produces in the reverse a black inferiority. And this is fulfilling what Jesus said, as a man thinketh, so is he. And as long as our people think the way they think, we will never be able to do what we as a people should do to correct our condition.
Blacks were programmed to obey. The inferiority of the black man and woman, sadly, was planted, as one would a seed, sowed to the ground, programmed. And after having their mindset established on the programming, staying in line became, in a matter of time, a habit, a nature, serving the programmer. This could happen to any mammal with a behavioral pattern. Only in this case, it is a singular race, a particular specimen of people, the blacks. And it has been so for centuries.
We as black people have to provide a future for our people, for the government, and white people are not providing a future for us. So it is wrong for us to stay around laying at the foot of white people like the Bible's Lazarus, begging for crumbs that fall from their table when we can go and make a table of our own. But a welfare mentality was created when my fathers and mothers were made slaves and robbed of the knowledge of themselves and dependent totally on a slave master for food, clothing, and shelter. So that when we were so-called set free by the 13th Amendment, we didn't have the mentality of a free people to go and do for ourselves. So we turned right back around and volunteered our services for not free labor, but so close to free labor.
Racism, a consciousness of extremities, an organismal dysfunction, could make the racist go any length to prove his superiority over another. In this mentality, dominance is the goal, not nobility. There is no nobility in a war. The racist lives like one fighting a war. And in a war, conquest is the only goal, and this comprises acts that are far from noble, as everything brute and savage is what happens in a war. For more than 2,000 years, people in many different parts of the world have forced their fellow humans into slavery. Only the inhumanity particularly decided against the African people stands out for all time. Between about 1500 and 1900, Europeans forcibly uprooted millions of people from throughout West Africa and West Central Africa and shipped them across the Atlantic in conditions of great cruelty. Traders set out from European ports towards Africa's west coast. There they bought people in exchange for goods and loaded them into the ships. The voyage across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, generally took 6 to 8 weeks. Once in the Americas, those Africans who had survived the journey were offloaded for sale and put to work as enslaved labor. To refer to the Africans who were enslaved only as slaves strips them of their identity. They were, for instance, farmers, merchants, priests, soldiers, goldsmiths and musicians. They were husbands and wives, fathers and mothers, sons and daughters. They could have been Yoruba, Igbo, Akan, Congolese, Africans, from all over the African continent. European slavers dispersed them across the Americas to lead lives of degradation and brutality, without thought for their personal lives. Millions died in the process. As a result, the people of African descent are spread throughout the Americas and Western Europe. This is now called the African diaspora. Now let's further delve into the history. Some time ago in the 18th century, a number of political and intellectual leaders had begun publicly to assert that Africans were naturally inferior and that they were indeed best suited for slavery. A few intellectuals revived an older image of all living things, the scala naturae, Latin, scale of nature, or great chain of being, to demonstrate that nature or God had made men unequal. This ancient hierarchical paradigm, encompassing all living creatures, starting with the simplest organisms and reaching to humans, angels, and then ultimately to God, became for the advocates of slavery a perfect reflection of the realities of inequality that they had created. The physical differences of blacks and Indians became the symbols or markers of their status. It was during these times that the term race became widely used to denote the ranking and inequality of these peoples. In other words, their placement on the chain of being. These white racists, in their twisted mindset, considered blacks a divine opportunity for their expansion and advancement.
The Greeks believed that leadership was a product of natural endowment. What does that mean? The Greeks believed that certain humans were born endowed with certain unique characteristics. If you weren't born with those qualities, then their conclusion was you were created by the divine gods to be a slave. It doesn't matter what you think about yourself. They would study you and see if you have those natural endowments. If you don't have them, it doesn't matter how many degrees you get from college. You are simply an educated slave. Another one of their beliefs is this: leadership is a product of birth traits. The Greeks believed that you who were born with certain unique traits were automatically leaders. Those who were born without those traits are automatically slaves. So their society was very, very neat. No traits, traits. Slaves, leaders. Let me give you an example, because when I read the traits, I became a little bit sick. One of the traits were, if you were born with sharp pointed nose, blue eyes, fair skin like white, and thin lips. This is written in their document. You were born to be a leader. So if I was born in Greece 2,000 years ago, there's no question where I belonged. So you just know where to go. You just behave yourself. So you were relegated by destiny to be a slave. The third thing the Greeks believed is very interesting. The Greeks believed that leadership was a product of providence. Providence means the gods chose you to be leaders. Therefore, those who were not chosen by the gods were destined to be followers. Destined means you ain't got a chance to be a leader. Now, this is very important here. So you ever wonder why the Greeks had so many gods? They were polytheists. That's a big word. It simply means many gods. It's the Greeks who had gods like Zeus and Apollos. These are Greek gods. They had gods like Diana of the Ephesians, all these weird gods. They had hundreds of gods. Matter of fact, the Greek rulers believed they were sons of the gods. And they're saying that those who were born and not chosen by the gods are supposed to serve us who were chosen by the gods. In other words, you were born to serve me if you got big nose, black skin.
Thus, the slave trade and slavery had begun without the need for a conscience. In most cases, blacks weren't even seen as fellow humans, thus are not seen as things that require human feeling nor sympathy. As the slave trade developed, Europeans created a racist ideology which could be used to justify the trade. Africans were thought to be subhuman, uncivilized, and inferior to Europeans in every way. The word was, as they were not one of us, they could be bought and sold. The development of racism is linked to the slave trade. The slave trade could not have continued without the said ideology to justify it. Racism cannot be ignored in any study of the slave trade. The English had equated blackness with death and evil, centuries before they met any black people. Thus, the first reaction to people with black skin was to assume that they were some form of devil or monster, or better still, servants. Miles Monroe wasn't near done yet on his expositions in this subject. God bless his resting soul.
So the Romans believed, since they destroyed the Greeks, that they were gifts of the gods. So the leader of the Roman Empire took the name Caesar. Caesar is not a name, it's a title. It means son of the gods. The Romans adopted the Greek theory of leadership, and they ruled the world with that. So anyone who was not a Roman was automatically a slave. So the Romans ruled the world, destroyed themselves. Now here's the big part. The Roman Empire did not fall by invasion. It fell by disintegration. Disintegration means it fell apart, like a piece of cake that just broke up in little pieces. And what happened was everybody scrambled for power. And the result was many little kingdoms. Let me give you some of their names. Spanian, Franco, Belgium. Those Roman kingdoms. Anglo, Roman kingdoms. We know these kingdoms in English. Franco, France. Belgium, Belgium. Porco, Portugal. Anglo, Spanian. They're all kingdoms. They are all Romans. So their psyche, their mentality, ingrained. We were chosen by the gods to rule anybody who don't have our traits. They were chosen by the gods to be our servants and our slaves. They are not complete divine beings like us. We are superior. And the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the British, Anglo, call them Anglican, they decided to expand their kingdoms. So they came to Africa and the Caribbean. And we call it colonization. Colonization is the expansion of Greek leadership philosophy. So going to Africa and bringing slaves over as merchandise was easy. Why? Big nose, big lip, dark skin. I found 1 million servants, they say. So they come to the West. They establish their plantations, whether it is Carolina or Florida or Louisiana or the Bahamas or Jamaica. They had their plantations and they couldn't use the people they met here because they killed them out with disease. And so they went and found some divine slaves chosen by the gods to work the ground. And they brought them over on ships. And the first ones to bring them was the Portuguese. The Portuguese told the British, we found some people to work the farms. And the British said, where you got them from? They follow us. And they went to the west coast of Africa. And then the French found out. The French says, oh, let's go get some too. And then the Spanish says, oh, let's get some too. And everybody started dashing for divine slaves. Remember, divine means you were chosen by the gods. That is in the psyche of the system.
From this, and from travelers' tales, arose the stereotype of the African as barbarous, prone to excessive sexual desire, lazy, untrustworthy, and even cannibalistic. There were few who challenged this prejudiced view. Richard Ligon, in his book A True and Exact History of the Island of Barbados, published in 1657, wrote against the popular view. He believed that there are as honest, faithful, and conscionable people amongst them as amongst those of Europe. From about 1600, with the development of science in Europe, racism could be proved scientifically. Scientists and philosophers like David Hume could state that Africans were naturally inferior to the whites. It was widely believed that Africans and Europeans had developed separately. Many, like Sir Thomas Herbert, writing in 1634, believed that Africans must be descended from apes and were part of a separate and inferior race. This was long before Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, which showed that all humans are part of the same species. In the 18th and 19th century, many white people campaigned for an end to the slave trade and for freedom for the slaves. But few of those white people believed in racial equality, that is, equality between the black and white races. Beginning in the late 18th century, differences between the races became magnified and exaggerated in the public mind. Hundreds of battles with Indians had pushed these populations westward to the frontiers or relegated them increasingly to reservation lands. A widely accepted stereotype had grown that the Indian race was weak and would succumb to the advances of white civilization, so that these native peoples would no longer be much of a problem. Their deaths from disease and warfare were seen as a testament to the inevitable demise of the Indian. Racial stereotyping of Africans was magnified by the Haitian Rebellion of 1791. This heightened the American fear of slave revolts and retaliation, causing greater restrictions and ever harsher and more degrading treatment. Grotesque descriptions of the low-status races, blacks and Indians, were widely publicized, and they helped foster fear and loathing. This negative stereotyping of low-status racial populations was ever present in the public consciousness, and it affected relations among all people. In the 19th century, racist ideologies were strengthened by fake sciences such as phrenology. It was believed that the shape of the skull reflected the character of the person. Phrenologists applied their theory to African skulls and classified all Africans as inferior to white races intellectually, culturally, and morally. Phrenology showed Africans to be unsuited to work other than that supervised by white people. In the minds of most, this justified making Africans work as slaves. The inferiority, or inferiorizing of the blacks, got to this mad point in history where the stimulus act of black slaves escaping for freedom was even named a disease, an ailment. Isn't that the most hilarious thing ever? The mysterious and chronic sickness, it was said, had been afflicting slaves for years, working its way into their minds and causing them to flee from their plantations.
Ha! Now this is laughable.
You just wait until you hear more. The story has only begun. Unknown still in medical literature then, the said troubling symptoms, it was said, which had made these suffering slaves escape, or show the want to escape, from the sufferings in the plantations and the cruelties of their masters, were familiar to masters and overseers, especially in the South, where hundreds of enslaved people ran from captivity every year. But who wouldn't want to escape from such day-to-day brutal inhumanity? The South, as a matter of fact, was known to have the most terrible zones for black slaves. However, on March 12, 1851, the noted physician Samuel A. Cartwright reported to the Medical Association of Louisiana that he had identified the malady and, by combining two Greek terms, given it a name, drapetomania. Drapetes, a runaway, and mania, madness. He also announced that it was completely curable. These were the words of Cartwright to fellow doctors. Negroes, with their smaller brains and blood vessels, and their tendency toward indolence and barbarism, had only to be kept benevolently in the state of submission, awe, and reverence that God had ordained. The Negro is then spellbound and cannot run away, he said. Cartwright's presentation a decade before the Civil War was part of the long, insidious practice of what historians call scientific racism. The spread of bogus theories of supposed black inferiority in an attempt to rationalize slavery and centuries of social and economic domination and plunder. Here, enslaved people were beneath even the human desire for freedom. They had to be diseased. This thinking would thrive in the 18th and especially the 19th centuries. It would mutate, vary in perversion, and persevere for 400 years right up to the present day. Starting with theories of physical and intellectual inferiority that likened blacks to animals, monkeys and apes especially, or helpless children, it would evolve to infer black cultural and then social inferiority. What black inferiority meant has changed in every generation, but ultimately Americans have been making the same case, said historian Ibram X. Kendi. Such thought exists today, with pernicious assumptions about the current nature of black life and black people, still featuring age-old racist references to blacks as animals. It persists despite the advent of modern DNA science, which has shown race to be fundamentally a social construct. Consider comedian Roseanne Barr's use of an ape analogy in a tweet about Valerie Jarrett, an African-American advisor to President Barack Obama, which led to the cancellation of Barr's ABC television show. Now consider Cartwright's claims in 1851 that, among other things, a Negro withstood the rays of the sun better because of an eye feature like one found in apes. Cartwright also speciously observed that the black man's neck was shorter than a white person's. His bile was a deeper color, his blood blacker, his feet flatter, his skull different. Yet, in addition to his keen eyesight, he had other animal-like senses, smelling better and hearing better than the white man. Like children, Negroes require government in everything, or they will run into excesses, Cartwright said. Slavery, he concluded unsurprisingly, was for the enslaved person's own good. The twisted vestiges of scientific racism continue to inspire white hatred of and violence toward blacks today. Anyone who thinks that white and black people look as different as we do on the outside, but are somehow magically the same on the inside, is delusional, mass murderer Dylan Roof wrote in the crude manifesto that he posted on the internet in 2015. Negroes have lower IQs, lower impulse control, and higher testosterone levels in generals. These three things alone are a recipe for violent behavior. On June 17, 2015, Roof went into an African-American church in Charleston, SC, and shot 9 black worshippers to death. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. Self-interested justifications for atrocities against and the oppression of African Americans go back to the 1400s, and an early Portuguese defense of slave trading written by Gomes Enes de Zurara, wrote Kendi, a professor at American University in Washington, in his book, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, which won the 2016 National Book Award. Zurara wrote that captured Africans had lived like beasts, without any custom of reasonable beings, and only knew how to live in bestial sloth. Once enslaved, their souls could be saved and their lives improved, he said. On this side of the Atlantic, Thomas Jefferson played an early and highly influential role in the establishment of pseudoscientific ideas about black racial inferiority. On February 27, 1787, more than a decade after he helped write the Declaration of Independence, future President Jefferson published his book, Notes on the State of Virginia, an extensive study of subjects including his state's geography, climate, religion, and its enslaved black population. The book made clear that when the revered founding father said it was self-evident that all men are created equal, he was not including black people. In general, their existence appears to participate more of sensation than reflection, wrote Jefferson, whose livelihood depended on the existence of slavery. In imagination, they are dull and tasteless. This unfortunate difference of color and perhaps of faculty is a powerful obstacle to the emancipation of these people. Deep-rooted prejudices, real distinctions which nature has made, and many other circumstances will probably never end but in the extermination of the one or the other race, he wrote. It was perhaps the most damaging and enduring instance of scientific racism in American history. This was one of the best-selling non-fiction books in early America, and black and other anti-racist activists were arguing against Jefferson's theory of black intellectual inferiority into the 1830s. In 1849, Samuel Cartwright was engaged by a Louisiana medical committee to investigate the diseases and physical peculiarities of Negro population. He seemed well qualified. The 57-year-old native of Fairfax County, Vietnam, had practiced in Natchez, Miss, for 25 years, and his patients included his friend Jefferson Davis, the future president of the Confederacy. The same year the report was issued, he was appointed professor of diseases of the Negro at what is now Tulane University. He began his report for the Louisiana Committee by reviewing the anatomical and physiological differences between the Negro and the white man. Skin color was obvious, but there are other differences more deep, durable, and indelible, he wrote. The membranes, the muscles, the tendons, even the Negro's brain and nerves, are tinctured with a shade of pervading darkness. Then there was the true cause of the enslaved person's debasement of mind, he wrote. It is the defective hematosis, or atmospherization of the blood, conjoined with a deficiency of cerebral matter in the cranium that has rendered the people of Africa unable to take care of themselves, he claimed. By the mid-19th century, race in the popular mind had taken on a meaning equivalent to species-level distinctions, at least for differences between blacks and whites. The ideology of separateness that this proclaimed difference implied was soon transformed into social policy. Although legal slavery in the United States ended in 1865 with the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, the ideology of race continued as a new and major form of social differentiation in both American and British society. The Black Codes of the 1860s and the Jim Crow laws of the 1890s were passed in the United States to legitimize the social philosophy of racism. More laws were enacted to prevent intermarriage and intermating, and the segregation of public facilities was established by law, especially in the South. The country's low-paying, dirty and demeaning jobs were relegated to the Negro, as he was seen fit for only such tasks. Supreme Court decisions such as the Dred Scott case of 1857 made it clear that Negroes were not and could not be citizens of the United States. They were to be excluded from the social community of whites, but not from the production of their wealth. Repugnant. Now, who was Dred Scott? What happened? Dred Scott, 1799 to 1858, was born a slave in Southampton County, Virginia. His original owner, Peter Blow, moved to Alabama in 1818 and then relocated to St. Louis, Missouri in 1830, taking with him his property, which includes his slaves, as he moved west. Blow died in 1832, and Dr. John Emerson, an army surgeon, purchased Scott. In 1833, Emerson undertook a series of moves as part of his service in the U.S. military. He took Scott from Missouri, a slave state, to Illinois, a free state, and finally into the Wisconsin Territory, a free territory. During this period, Scott met and married Harriet Robinson, who became part of the Emerson household. Emerson married in 1838, and in the early 1840s, he and his wife returned with the Scotts to Missouri. In December 1843, Emerson suddenly died, leaving his estate, including the Scotts, to his widow. For the next 3 years, the Scotts worked as hired slaves, with the money they earned going to Irene Emerson. Scott offered to purchase his freedom, but Irene Emerson refused to sell him to himself. And in April 1846, he began the legal proceedings that would eventually bring his case to the Supreme Court, which issued the seminal ruling for which he became famous. That year, with the help of anti-slavery lawyers, Harriet and Dred Scott filed individual lawsuits for their freedom in Missouri State Court in St. Louis on the grounds that their residence in a free state and a free territory had freed them from the bonds of slavery. However, Scott's case reached the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled that he was not entitled to his freedom and, more broadly, that African Americans were not U.S. citizens. In essence, the decision argued that, as someone's property, Scott was not a citizen and could not sue in a federal court. The majority opinion by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney also stated that Congress had no power to exclude slavery from the territories, thus invalidating the Missouri Compromise, the 1820, and that African Americans could never become U.S. citizens. The Supreme Court decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, which permitted separate but equal facilities, guaranteed that the racial worldview, with its elements of separateness and exaggerated difference, would continue to flourish. The development of the idea and ideology of race coincided with the rise of science in American and European cultures. Much of the inspiration for the growth of science has been credited to the period known as the Enlightenment, that spanned most of the 18th century. Many early Enlightenment writers believed in the power of education and fostered very liberal ideals about the potentiality of all peoples, even savages, for human progress. Yet, later in the century, some of the earliest assertions about the natural inferiority of Africans were published. Major proponents of the ideology of race inequality were the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, the French philosopher Voltaire, the Scottish philosopher and historian David Hume, and the influential American political philosopher Thomas Jefferson. These writers expressed negative opinions about Africans and other primitives based on purely subjective impressions or materials gained from secondary sources, such as travelers, missionaries, and explorers. These philosophers expressed the common attitudes of this period. Most also had investments in the slave trade or slavery. All kinds of subjects and fields popping up year after year, from bias, hateful and derogatory assumptions of a singular race and people of color. All kinds of subjects and fields of falsehoods, developed and ushered in as legitimate, with the sole purpose of pressing down and keeping the people of color subjugated, dominated, and conquered inside out. However, the overdoing of this evil, with the whole brute actions that followed up to make it a living reality, ended up propping Africans with the abject mind frame of some inferior nature. This maladjusted most blacks to a mellow state, made them content with where they were, accepting what they are not. The study of teleology, for instance, looked at design in nature. This allowed men to argue that Africans were, by nature, suited to hard work but not to thinking. They were therefore obviously made to serve white people. The Negro in general is a born slave, wrote Sir Harry Johnston, a British colonial administrator in Africa in the 1890s. Anthropology, the study of mankind, looked at such things as the size of the brain and the physical appearance of people. Again, anthropologists could conclude that the African was inferior to the white man, a separate species more closely related to apes than to whites. The English naturalist Charles Darwin developed a theory of evolution. It suggested that Europeans were related to Africans and that all humans were related to the apes. Whilst this upset the anthropological theories about separate species, other aspects of the evolutionary theory still proved the superiority of the white races over all others. His theory saw the Anglo-Saxons, that is, the British, at the top of the evolutionary scale. The British were at the top of the family tree of the human race, as the most civilized race. The African, as a primitive race, was considered childlike and unintelligent. Such inferior races were doomed to be either ruled by or destroyed by the superior races. Survival of the fittest was the rule in Darwin's theory of evolution. All kinds of fields, studies, speculations, all false. The belief in the superiority of the British and European races fed the expansion of the empire. The British Empire grew from the idea that the British were the best race to rule the world, a view expressed by Cecil Rhodes, the colonial administrator who founded the British colony of Rhodesia in Central Africa, now Zimbabwe. The black family has been under siege for centuries. Black people in the United States endured more than 200 years of family-crushing enslavement and another 100 years of humiliation under Jim Crow. Even with the dramatic changes brought about by the movement for civil rights, continuing racial and economic discrimination, and, until recently, family-dividing welfare policies, have put black and white families on vastly unequal footings. In spite of these difficulties, an amazing number of black people have managed to succeed. But the constant assaults have worn many families down. The results show up plainly in the data. In 2006, nearly 80% of births to black women were out of wedlock. Approximately 35% of black children live with two parents, compared with 84% of Asian children, 76% of white children, and 66% of Hispanic children. Black children, who make up about 15% of all children under the age of 18 in the United States, account for 32% of the children in foster care. Black males are far more likely than other males to be incarcerated. Although differences among women are smaller than they are among men, black females are more likely than other females to be incarcerated. Too many black families are in crisis. Too many black children are facing bleak prospects. There is the festering of the soul which lingers way too deep in the black communities. Educator Robert Franklin calls it the love deficit. Psychiatrist Alvin Poussin and journalist Amy Alexander calls it self-loathing. Sociologist Joy DeGruy. Leary describes it as vacant esteem. Whatever we call it, a sense of not being fully worthy is at the core of what is ailing too many black people and families. There is, as theologian Cornel West has described it, a nihilism in black America, a disease of the soul, in which too many of us are coping with a life of lovelessness, that can only be tamed by love and care. A growing body of evidence suggests that the lie of black inferiority negatively affects black people's sense of self-worth and efficacy, undermines relationships between black men and women and between parents and children, limits black children's possibilities, and contributes to destructive behaviors in the black community. Slavery and Jim Crow are gone. The civil rights movement has opened many doors of opportunity. But the lie of black inferiority, the most devastating and longest-lasting consequence of the enslavement and colonization of African people, remains with us. The lie of black inferiority says that black people are not as beautiful, not as lovable, not as intelligent, not as capable, not as worthy as white people, or any other people for that matter. The lie was first told centuries ago to justify the dehumanization and subjugation of African people. For about 350 years, it has shaped other people's views of black people, and it has shaped our views of ourselves. The lie has hit at the very heart of the black family throughout the course of American history by undercutting our abilities to form healthy self-images and to create the healthy, nurturing relationships, marriages, and families that we and our children so desperately need. Nonetheless, the point here is simple. If you love yourself, you are more likely to be able to love other people. If you have a healthy regard for yourself, you are more likely to believe that you are entitled to good things, and you will be better able to build healthy, nurturing relationships. People who believe, at some level, that they are not as beautiful, not as lovable, not as intelligent, not as worthy, will find it hard to love themselves and the other people who look like them. They will find it hard to build nurturing relationships and families. In closing, this is not about blaming the victim. This is not about the past. It is very much about the present. It is about a destructive lie that still lingers, a lie that must be extinguished to make way for a healthier and stronger future for the African American family. Black people are not responsible for the lie, but we must assume primary responsibility for its eradication, so that we and our descendants can, at last, be free. Free to fully love ourselves and free to fully love each other. It is a new black order. This is another new black freedom. Black families everywhere around the world must be conscious enough to realize and assume the authority. It is called the Black Superiority. Love who you are and take charge. That brings us to the end of yet another interesting video segment. Reach us in the comment section if you enjoyed it. Like, share with families and friends to keep spreading our eye-opening black narrative, and subscribe to keep getting notifications for more. We're delighted to have you with us. Thank you for watching.